We are in the finals of the Speed Chess Championships with the two best players in the world in this format, Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja, playing against each other. It has to be said that in the semifinals, Alireza Firouzja played brilliant chess, completely destroying Hikaru Nakamura, while Magnus Carlsen was actually struggling a bit against Hans Niemann. A lot of blunders in their very spicy match. But okay, in the end, Magnus was way stronger and managed to reach the final. But Magnus admitted in his press conference after the game that, well, his level needs to be improved in order to have a chance against Alireza Firouzja. Now in this video, I would like to cover 3 very instructive games played by Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. In all these games he's playing with white, as we have a very special theme in these games, as we have a very cool opening to discuss. It's 1d4, Magnus opens with 1d4, knight of 6, c4, and we get the King's Indian. That's not something we do get to see every day. It's a very popular opening. It used to be played by players like Bobby Fischer, Garry Kasparov. Every now and then we see still top grandmasters employing it, but nowadays with the strongest engines you also see that white gets an advantage because white has more space, easier development, and that is, well, in general considered favorable for white in these structures. Now we have one of the old main lines which is very popular, and there are a lot of different ways of playing here for actually both sides. But here is black's turn, and Firouzja goes for the move h6. It's a popular move, has been seen in numerous games. Now you may think, why this pawn move? Is it that useful? Well, in certain cases, especially if white is ever going to take on e5 and try to play solid chess, then the bishop cannot come to g5. So that is one of the main ideas. Well, Magnus is not interested in taking on e5 yet. Played here the move rook e1. Also, thematical move in a lot of King's Indian structures, as after knight bd7, white drops back with the bishop to f1. Looks like very modest play, but it's all very standard, as the rook also does support a pawn on e4. Black goes for the move rook e8. And here, interesting idea, a rook to b1. White is getting his rook out of the diagonal. In case this diagonal gets opened, then the bishop doesn't hit the rook in the corner. So here, interestingly, there are a lot of different ways of playing here for black, and this is the starting position for our video. As let's start with the first game in the 5-minute section, in which black played here this move a5. So the idea is very clear. You want to take on d4 and then put your knight on c5. The knight is excellently placed as the pawn covers the b4 square, so white doesn't get a chance to play b4. Now, interestingly, this is the moment Magnus decides here to take on e5. We get a symmetrical structure. The queen comes to c2. And now you may think, okay, this hole on d4 is potentially weak, but will be very difficult for black to make use of it. While white has simple plans here, for instance, to put the bishop on e3, maybe start with h3, get the rook over to d1, and at some point maybe even jump in with the knight to d5. For that reason, Firouzja played here c6. It's a very thematical move in a lot of King's Indian structures to cover this square, preventing the white knight from coming to d5. But it does have a clear drawback, as here white played the move knight a4. A remarkable change of plans, change of directions, as the knight at the side of the board is doing pretty well. Look at this. Knight h5 played, also typical way of trying to generate some counterplay, as the knight is on its way to f4, from where it later on it may go to e6. But here the bishop comes to e3. Excellent move. The knight comes to f4, and white played the move rook b to d1. Queen e7, getting out of the d file, so the knight is no longer pinned. But here, excellent move by Magnus. He played here the move c5. Why is this such a good move? Well, you're trying to make use of both the d6 square, so at some point probably the rook can land on that square, while after black moves the knight away from d7, which was played in the game because you really want your bishop to be developed as well, then the knight comes to b6, and that is basically what white had been aiming for. Now the white is back in the game very soon. Also the bishop may come to c4, and well, white is perfectly in control. Here, Critical moment in the game, as I believe that Firouzja made a mistake. He played his rook to b8, which is understandable. You don't want to hang your rook. On the other hand, what the machine really likes here for black is something like bishop g4, ignoring the rook, and after taking it, bishop takes f3. First, black is destroying the structure on the king side, and after rook takes a8, white is an exchange up. But okay, there's only one open file. It will not be that simple for white to make use of it. And there's always some sort of counterplay. The knights can come in. There's already one knight on f4. Maybe the other one can come to d4. So this would have been, especially with a shorter time control, a good practical attempt for black to stir things up. Let's have a look what happened in the game, because there followed the move rook b8. But we all know that in the King's Indian, this light squared bishop is a very important weapon for black. So Magnus doesn't hesitate, whips it off here with the move knight takes c8, rook takes, and here the rook comes into d6. Beautiful square for the rook. White is intending to double, and whenever black is going to contest the rook on the d file with something like rook d8, you're always ready to take back with your pawn. That's the main strength of this pawn. Now, okay, it looks like it's still an interesting position. White is clearly better, but especially also such a bishop on g7 doesn't look great at all. Well, look at this. Black played here the move b6, undermining the pawn on c5. If you do take, the rook will be hanging. But here, Magnus has a different plan. Very instructive. This is the moment he decides here to take on f4. Very often, that is not a move you want to play, because after pawn takes, the diagonal for the bishop comes open and the bishop is coming alive. But there's a good follow-up, as white played here the move e5. So now both pawns are nicely supporting the rook, and after pawn takes c5, the bishop comes to c4. White is not even interested in regaining the pawn on c5, but he wants to activate his pieces as quickly as he can. Rook e8 played, and the queen comes to d2 to protect the rook on d6 and also attacking the pawn on f4. Well, g5 played to prevent white from capturing there. In certain cases, g4 can be played. So Magnus, very cool move now, simple move, prophylactical idea to play h3, just covering the g4 square. There are never any back rank issues. In case of a check, the king can always come to h2. Knight g6 played. So the knight is targeting the pawn on e5, but now it is rook d1. White is ignoring the threat and hits the rook on d8, practically forcing black to take on d6, because if the rook is going away, then white will put a rook on d7 with an attack against the queen as well as the pawn on f7. So all white's pieces are in great shape. Rook takes rook, pawn takes back, attacking the queen. The queen went to a7 to defend this pawn. Now the queen comes to d3, threatening to take the knight on g6. Every move comes with tempo. And note, of course, that the pawn is a bad defender because it's pinned. So the knight goes back to f8. Here it is, rook to e1. The rook has done its job and now joins the open file. So that after rook d8, the rook comes in to e7, attacking the queen. And well, you can't really take the rook because after taking on e7, taking on d3, well, there are various moves. You can take the rook, you can promote here immediately. So everything is just winning. Well, instead, there followed rook d7, trying to neutralize the pressure along the 7th rank. But there is bishop takes f7 with check. The king goes away. Now everything can be swapped. The bishop comes back and white's d-pawn is simply way too strong. Look at how Magnus finishes off the game here. Knight h7, queen c4, setting up a battery, threatening mate on g8. Queen d8, queen e6. And after bishop takes b2, the pawn comes to d7. Very nice idea. Knight f6, attacking the pawn on d7, but now it is knight e5, protecting the pawn, threatening a knight fork on f7. So here black decided to give up the bishop. The queen takes back, so the knight is pinned here. Knight cannot take the pawn. If you take with the queen on d7, it is queen takes f6 and it's game over. So black brought the king to g7 to defend the knight, but now the bishop comes in to support the pawn. The only thing white needs to do is try to get rid of that queen on d8. Look at this. Simple chess, c4, queen d4, maintaining the pin and about to wrap up the remaining pawns. King f8, queen c5, check, king g7, queen takes pawn. Black played desperate move g4, but everything is just lost. Pawn takes, king f8, queen c5. Note that whenever you go queen to e7, there is d8 queen, and white wins the game. King g7 was played instead, but after queen c8, black is no longer able to keep the blockade on the promotion square. So this was game 5 of the match, and Magnus won the first game with the King's Indian. Now, let's go back to that critical position after rook to b1, because in the next black game by Firouzja, he deviated here with the move c6. And that is, of course, also a very typical thematical move in a lot of King's Indian structures, but it has a very clear drawback, as now white is going to play the move d4, d5. Fantastic idea. So, why is this such a good move? Well, you're closing the center, but the pawn is on c6. First of all, you're threatening to take on c6 and win the pawn on d6. Black, of course, can here decide to block the position with the move c5. But here, in this block structure, white is so much better. Especially this knight on d7, it's pretty bad. It can no longer go to c5. It's hindering the bishop, it is hindering the rook. White has different ways of playing, including a simple expansion on the queen side. Now, therefore, Firouzja didn't close the position. He instead decided here to take on d5. But in general, black is playing on the king side and white has plans to break through on the queen side. That is the main strategy. Now the c-file is open. There are always plans for white to try to find a way to infiltrate, either with a rook on the open file or one of the major pieces are able to join there as well. Look at what happened as Firouzja played a6, probably preparing b5, knight b6, grabbing some space on the queen side, but a4 is a good move, preventing that expansion by black. Knight h5, and white continues with b4. So white looks like he's making quite fast progress on the queen side. And here, in these positions with a block structure, the plan with f5 is less active here, especially because the rook is not on f8. If the rook is on the f file, there's usually more pressure being generated by black. But here I think with moves like knight e2, white has a firm grip on the e4 square, is even threatening to take on f5. Sometimes the knight can come to c4. So also here you see the pawn on d6 is quite vulnerable. Now anyway, black didn't play f5. Black played knight df6, but I felt this is quite a sad move, because where is the counterplay? You're blocking the f-pawn only to open up the path for the bishop, but white is incredibly fast. a5, very nice technical move. Bishop d7 played, so black is about to go rook c8 and create pressure on the c-file. But again, knight a4 with the idea to get a knight to b6 to hit the rook. And then also there's this idea to eliminate potentially black's best minor piece. And well, that's very problematic. I mean, the question is, how should black react to it? In the game there followed bishop takes knight, but again, now the queen comes into play, queen c8 played, maybe looking for counterplay with queen g4 at some point, but white goes b5, and white is about to take on a6, open the b file so that the rook can come in to b6 to hit both the pawn on a6 and the pawn on d6. The bishop can come to a3, for instance. I don't see what black is going to do in the meantime. Well, pawn takes pawn, queen takes back, hitting the pawn on b7, but black goes knight f4. And obviously, if you do take the pawn on b7, then black can simply take on a5. And I mean, you don't want to trade off that good pawn on a5 against the backward pawn on the b file. That's a very bad trade. What should white do here? Well, I do like a waiting move like a3, with the point that, okay, maybe black is threatening to go queen g4 and look for counterplay with knight h3 check, and then the pawn on f2 will come under threat. That is one idea. Second idea I found also very thematical is rerouting the knight from f3 once again to c4 with the idea to hit the pawn, threatening knight b6. And in case the queen comes to g4, the third rank is cleared, and a plan like rook b3 to cover all the squares on the third rank or even to hit the queen away. It's a very thematical defensive idea for white. So white has an overwhelming advantage, but like in the previous game, Magnus has a concrete way of handling the position. As here again, he decides to whip off the knight for the bishop. So bishop takes, pawn takes, and here the breakthrough in the center. Pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, and if you purely look at positional aspects, then white is clearly better thanks to the better pawn structure. He does have a passed pawn, but with very precise play, black can neutralize that pawn with the move bishop f8, which was not played in the game, but it's a key idea to gain control over the d6 square. The pawn cannot be pushed. And if white plays something like knight c4, one instructive line here is to swap the rooks on e1 and then put the queen on c5. So if queens are coming off the board, it will be much easier to challenge that pawn on d5. And one key point, and this is incredibly difficult to see, especially in speed chess, after queen takes b7, hitting the rook, you can ignore the threat here with knight g4, hitting the pawn on f2, and all of a sudden it's white who gotta watch out here, because if you take the rook, queen takes f2, king h1, queen takes e1, all of a sudden it's black who is winning here, and you can see that these passed pawns, they don't really matter at all. Well, anyway, bishop f8, still very interesting defensive resource, was not played. Here, Firouzja played the move queen c3, which does look very attractive to attack the knight and indirectly hit the rook on e1 twice as well. But the reason why this is such a huge mistake is that white is not gonna cooperate with black's ideas. Instead, Magnus played here the key move queen takes b7, capturing that valuable pawn. And obviously, if you do take the knight, well, the rook in the corner is hanging, so that knight cannot be taken. While if you do take with the rook on a5, then it is queen takes f7. So there is actually a nice idea to capture the pawn, but also to win a second one. In the game there followed king h7, getting out of any sort of annoying check. Now if you do take on f7, there is rook takes e5, so you shouldn't be too tempted to take the pawn, but you can run with your a pawn, secure that pawn. It's now supported by the bishop. Now, because the rook from e8 can't move, black played rook ab8, queen c6, offering the exchange of queens, queen d4, rooks are coming off the board, and here it is, queen to c4. White is up one pawn, but look at these two pawns, they are incredibly powerful. Queen d2 counterplay, not really. Knight f3 defends the rook and hits the queen at the same time. Queen a5, d6 played, opening up the diagonal for the queen, g5, h3, and here after rook d8, actually, before Magnus got a chance to execute his next move, Firouzja resigned because there is queen takes f7. Black doesn't get a chance here to take that pawn, as there is rook e7 with mating threats along the 7th rank. Well, I thought this was also a very impressive game. Now, one more exciting game played between these two giants, as we have seen now the moves a5 and also the move c6. In the next blitz game, with 3 minutes only, there followed the move b6. Now this idea has been seen in a number of modern games within the King's Indian, but it's kind of an unusual way of developing your bishop. I'm not really sure if you want to put the bishop on b7, because white always has ideas to block the center. In any case, white played the move d5 immediately. Why is this structure not so good? Well, the pawn on c7 is a backward pawn and can become a liability later on. But the strategy of black here is to set up a blockade on the queen side with the move a5. Now white played the move a3. Excellent point, so that black doesn't get a chance here to play knight c5. You wish you could play that move to get that knight here, maybe to play bishop d7 and to play a4. But it's not possible because of b4, and the knight is kicked away by the pawn. Note that everything is well supporting the pawn on e4. So therefore, after a3, black played here this move, rook f8, admitting that the rook is not well placed on e8. Usually when you put a rook on e8, you first capture on d4 to ensure that the rook does get some play against the pawn on e4. Now white is really making quick progress on the queen side. With the move b4, so the knight cannot come to that c5 square. But what is going to be black's main source of counterplay? That is absolutely unclear to me. Knight h7 played, looking for f5 ideas. And you may think this is just a normal King's Indian position. Well, then you got it wrong. This is Magnus Carlsen playing against the King's Indian. And his next move is super class. This is easy for him, but very difficult for us to find in over the board play. He came up with this move g3. When you see this move for the first time, you think, why would you play that pawn move in front of your king? Well, the key idea is now that if black wants to go f5, white can put his knight on h4. Now the pawn is supporting the knight on h4. The queen can't take it for that reason. And white is threatening to take the pawn on g6. If you defend here that pawn with your queen, for instance, then the problem is that white is going to take on f5, black does recapture, and the knight comes into b5. And here you see that the pawn on c7 cannot be defended anymore. So here there are just a lot of problems for black. Let's go back. Instead of f5, black for that reason played first the move bishop a6. So that in case the knight comes to b5, you can always take it with your bishop. But white played another excellent move. Queen c2 is kind of a useful move to get ready for some action on the c file. But you also do protect the pawn on e4 and discourage black from getting counterplay with the move f7, f5. Well, that was actually played in the game. And here Firouzja probably felt that things are still interesting. But he certainly underestimated here again this move, knight h4. Attacking the pawn on g6. And, well, question is how to react. I mean, here queen f6 is played by Firouzja. And now you understand why the bishop is on a6, right? That knight b5 is not an issue here at all. But there is another problem. Because here white has a thematical follow-up. Pawn takes f5, g takes f5, and the bishop comes to h3. This is the second point of placing the pawn on g3. 3 times the pawn on f5 is under an attack. There is no more way to defend the pawn. You cannot advance the pawn to f4 because then the knight on d7 will be hanging. Therefore, the move e4 was played by Firouzja, closing the diagonal of the queen on c2. So the pawn on f5 is defended. In the meantime, black is threatening to take the knight on c3. But the killer move here is knight takes pawn. The pawn is gone now. Pawn recaptures. Bishop takes knight. White is a very big pawn up. And look, the center, the f-file is open. But thanks to the queen on c2, the pawn on f2 is well defended. Black is completely busted here because the pawn on e4 is going to drop as well. Bishop to c8 played. Now everything can be swapped. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes back, rook takes e4. That is pawn number 2. Black played here the move knight g5, hitting the rook. But since white is 2 pawns up, we can seriously consider further simplifications with bishop takes knight, pawn takes knight, attacking the knight on h4. And well, there are still a number of moves. You can go back with a knight to g2 if you want. But I do like even more this idea of ignoring the threat, just setting up a more valuable threat with your own rook. The queen can't really do anything. If the queen comes to d4, then the key move is knight g6, attacking the rook. If the rook goes away, there is also knight e7 with an attack against the queen, against the king, and the rook on c8. So white is going to win the exchange at least. Now, after rook e6, black resigns, in fact, because after queen f7, well, you can also go knight g6, attacking the rook. If the rook goes to e8, again, you're 2 pawns up. A simple move like rook b e1 to support the rook on e6. Like in the other game with the open d file, now the pawn on d5 nicely supports the rook on e6. So here we have seen 3 fantastic games played by Magnus Carlsen. How to play against the King's Indian. this is your video to check out more carefully once again. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Just one little favor is to hit the subscribe button. And in the next couple of days, I do hope to produce some more videos from this exciting event with some of the best players in the world. And also don't forget that the most fun tournament of the year, the Olympiad, is going to start very soon. So I'm expecting a lot of work to boost the channel. So I hope to see you soon back again. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.